I just want to go ahead and thank you guys for tuning in to the Young Faith podcast and being faithful to the episodes, being faithful to listening the episodes. A lot of you probably know the topic of today's episode. If you don't, it's love your enemies. Um, it's honestly it's a harder command for us to do as humans, pretty much you could say. It's definitely not easy. But the Bible does stress this command pretty much. There's multiple times where Jesus talked about this command, where he preached about this command, he taught about this command. One example is Sermon on the Mount. Jesus taught many times in many different verses throughout Matthew. He taught love your enemies, and then also on Sermon on the Plain and Luke, he also taught many different verses about love your enemies. And majority of the bulk of our text will be coming out of Matthew, Luke, and then a few other books back in the Old Testament. So just by these few books that I've listed, we can go ahead and tell that the Bible really does stress loving your enemies. And like I mentioned earlier, this is a harder command that we're commanded to do. Why? Because we're human, and with the fallen mind, with the world, when sin entered the world, this problem also entered. And the Bible stresses it. No man is perfect at this command, but it's important that we try, and we'll get to the reasons why behind that later. But I want to talk about the benefits from loving your enemies. So some may think that it's just a one-sided thing. We love our enemies, nothing in return. But the Bible actually tells us that we can bless our own life if we do it for the right reason, of course. But also generally just to make the world a better place. By you turning an enemy to a friend, you get a friend in the end of it, but you also just generally make the world a better place. I do have a few questions as we go through this episode regarding our topic of choice today. Why love our enemies? Who is considered an enemy? And how do we love our enemies? And the last question there is honestly probably one of the most important that we will discuss tonight. Why love our enemies is the first one we're going to discuss. And I have a few different answers, but the first answer and the most important is pretty much just because the Bible tells us to. We can look in Luke chapter 6, verse 27. But I say to you, who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. What the Bible is telling us here is simply to love our enemies, and if someone hates us or if someone does bad to us, still to love them, not just to love people who love us. We can look here and later in Luke 6 at verse 35 here. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Here again, maybe 8 verses later, the Bible is telling us again to love our enemies. So we can understand that it's a stressed topic. It's a very stressed topic in the Bible. And of course, at the end it says expect nothing in return, which I mentioned earlier, but we can go later on we have later verses that explain what happens if we love our enemies. Another reason why is it's just the right thing to do. It's the godly thing to be. We strive to be like Christ-like. And this is one of those things, loving our enemies and expecting nothing in return for doing it. And another reason of why we love our enemies is there's a good chance that it's going to help us overcome evil. We can look at a small portion of Romans chapter 12, verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What the Bible is saying here is just what the verse says. We don't need to be overcome by evil. We don't want evil to overcome us. But we can overcome evil with the good. I have also a few quotes here just pretty much to back this up. It's by George Washington. I will never let another man ruin my life by making me hate him. And just by that themselves, of course, it's not scripture, but it's a quote by a very famous man with a lot of success. He's telling us here, why hate another man? It's just going to ruin your life. Pretty much, it's pointless. But it's still hard, but it's pointless. That's why we need to love our enemies. We can look here, Richard Nixon. Those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. So what he's saying here is, if someone hates you, don't hate them back. And then they don't win that. I mean, they can hate you, but as long as you don't hate them back and you show them love, eventually they'll come around. But later in the quote, it says, and then you destroy yourself. What's that mean? That's saying, if you hate them, then you destroy yourself, and they do win. Another quote, Martin Luther King Jr. Love is the only forcible capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. What that's saying is pretty much that love can turn an enemy into a friend, and then that friend can get closer to us, and then we have the opportunity to share the gospel to that friend, and then we can totally change their life, their kids' life, grandchildren's life, and it's a chain reaction from there. We could start a whole new generation of Christians just by loving our enemy. Now the next question I have is, who is considered an enemy? Anyone who curses you is a good example the Bible gives us, or speaks bad about you, speaks ill, uses profane against you. We can look here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. It says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. We also, let's look at James chapter 4, verse 11. Do not speak against one another. What's these verses saying here? Of course, Matthew is telling us again to love our enemies and pray for those who hurt us, who persecute us, who speak bad about us, who speak ill about us, who use profane against us. The Bible is telling us here that it's important that we love our enemies, no matter what they do, no matter how much harm they do to us. The Bible is telling us here to love our enemies. We can look here in James 4:11. It's stressing for us not to speak against one another, not against your back, not about them, don't speak ill about them, don't speak profanity to them. We also can look, who else is considered an enemy? Anyone who hates or dislikes you. Matthew chapter 5, verse 45 through 47. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Verse 47 says, if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? This verse is clear here. This verse is telling us that if we love people who love us, that doesn't mean we love our enemies. If we love people who love us, we don't love our enemies. What the Bible is telling us here is that we have no reward for that, and there's no change there. Of course, love people who love you, but the Bible is telling us, it's stressing verse after verse to love our enemies, and don't just love people who love us. Love our enemies. That's what's important here. It's also telling us, don't just greet your brother. Don't greet people who greet you. Oh, of course, greet people who greet you, but also greet people who don't greet you. Love people who don't love you. That's what we're called to do here. And then the rest of the verse says, do not even the Gentiles do the same. Some more examples of that. People outside and inside church. That's very popular right there. A lot of people get in drama inside and outside the church. We also can look at coworkers. Maybe even someone who cut you off on your way to work this morning. Or if you're listening to this in the morning and someone just cut you off. There's an example there. Someone who made you upset. Even a family member. Sometimes family members can make us upset. Sometimes we dislike family members. Sometimes we have a hatred for family members. But another key example to who's considered an enemy, we don't just have to hate them. Maybe they're just upsetting us. Maybe we avoid them. Maybe they upset us. Maybe we avoid them. Maybe we try not to spend time with them. Maybe at the Thanksgiving dinner, we try to avoid them. We try not to talk to them just because of blah, 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 a bunch of reasons. Maybe that could be considered an enemy, but we're still supposed to love those people. Another question I have is, how do we love our enemies? This is one of the last questions. How do we love our enemies? And like I mentioned earlier, with our fallen mind, when sin entered the world, we normally don't want to love our enemies. And I can't say that I always want to love an enemy, because I promise it's not as easy It's not as easy as the Bible almost would put it here. It's very complicated, and God understood. That's why God stresses it here, because He understood that we would have problems with this. It wouldn't just be, we wouldn't just catch on to it. And one of the reasons why we normally don't do it is because our flesh likes to defend itself. When someone barks at you, when someone says something bad about you, 9 times out of 10, our flesh is telling us to respond back to that, to say negative things back to them, to say ill things back to them, to speak about them. It may not be back to them, but our flesh tells us to speak back to them, to someone else, to talk behind their back. And the Bible tells us simply, don't do that. The Bible tells us to love everyone. But the Bible also tells us to pray for our enemies. But I can agree here, that's just as hard. Our flesh, it's unnatural to pray for our enemies. But we have to be the opposite of that. We have to make it a habit. It has to be natural to pray for our enemies. Why? Because like the answer I provided earlier, simply because the Bible tells us to. That's why. That's why we have to love our enemies. That's why we have to make it natural to pray for our enemies, because the Bible tells us to. Most of the time we want to say something back. Our flesh eats us alive to say something back. And sometimes, majority of the time, we can get away with holding our tongue. If we really, really work on it and we're passionate about it, sometimes we want to say something back, but we can stop ourselves. We can hold back ourselves. But it's not like that for everyone. Someone will say something to you, and it just like ticks something off, and you're immediately will jump back. But we're not supposed to do that. We're not called to do that. And I struggle with that with myself. I'm not perfect at it at all. I struggle with it, and so does everyone else. But what's so important about loving our enemies is also the number one reason the Bible says so, but also we're the light in the midst of darkness. Almost we as Christians are supposed to be the love in the midst of darkness. And if we don't show that love to the world, who else is going to? If we don't show love to people who are full of evil and hatred, who else is going to? It's really, really, really important that we love our enemies. I mentioned it many times. The Bible stresses it. I have 9 more verses right here that I'm about to read, just of the Bible stressing to love your enemies and pray for those. Now, how do we love our enemies? By blessing them. Peter, Paul, and Jesus, all 3 stated this in the Bible. And there's many, many more books that have talked about blessing people, blessing our enemies. This is Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 speaking. This is Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's Jesus speaking here. Those are Jesus' words wrote down in the Gospel of Matthew during the Sermon on the Mount. So number one, Jesus has commanded us to love others and pray for those who persecute us. Pray for those who do ill against us, who speak bad about us. Now here's Paul talking. Bless those who persecute you. Now that's two role models we are commanded to bless those who persecute us and pray for those. Now here's Peter talking. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 9. Not returning evil for evil or insult for insult. What that's saying here is if someone does evil to you, don't return evil back. If someone says an insult about you, don't return an insult back. If someone speaks ill about you or uses profane language against you, do not do the same back. But, it says, but giving a blessing instead. Give them a blessing. Pray for them. Bless them. For you were called for the very purpose. And like I mentioned earlier, who would be the light in the midst of darkness? Peter says it here. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. And when I went back up earlier saying that some of the benefits of loving your enemy, here Peter explains it here perfectly. You might inherit a blessing. If we do it for the right way, we might inherit a blessing. Just a little fill in here. Blessing means to speak well of or speak well to. And to go with blessing here, another point I have is by doing good to them. We see this in both covenants. Exodus chapter 23, verse 4 through 5. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. What that's saying here is that if someone hates you and there's an opportunity for you to help them out, take the opportunity. Be a role model and take the opportunity. Be Christ-like and take the opportunity. Another verse here is Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who speak spitefully use you, and persecute you. What that's saying here is, I read this verse earlier, but I finished the rest of the verse out here. The Bible is just stressing, love your enemies, love your enemies, love your enemies. Why? Because it's important. It's very, very important. Another verse, Luke chapter 6, verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Now another one we can do is have a good will. We look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8. Paul explains this beautifully here. He explains it beautifully. The words are powerful here. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. Is not puffed up. Does not behave rudely. Does not seek its own. Is not provoked. Thinks no evil. Does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Bears all things. Paul is telling us exactly here what love doesn't do. What if we love, we won't do. That's Paul is explaining that beautiful here. And the last point I have is most importantly, where it starts everything at is we need to look at ourselves. Take a step back and focus on yourself and ask God. My favorite verse, this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible, probably in my top 5. It's Psalms chapter 139, verses 23. It's, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And you can honestly use that you could step back and use that as a prayer to help God to search you. Allow him to know your heart. Allow him to know why you feel these ways and how to work on these ways. Allow God to know your thoughts. Know your thoughts about why you feel this way towards a person. Later on in that verse, this is a paraphrase because I actually don't have it wrote down, but they're speaking and saying, telling God to, if he has any wicked ways, to clear them and allow him to continue in the everlasting life. So that's also a very important verse. And my last point here is simply ask God why you feel that way. Like I mentioned, take a step back and tell God to search you. And just generally ask God, take a moment with God and ask him, say, why do I feel the way I feel towards this person? And then ask him to help you light the burden you have towards that person. I appreciate you guys listening to the episode tonight. I hope you guys enjoy this one. If you haven't listened to any of the older episodes, I recommend you do go listen to those. And like I mentioned earlier, we really do appreciate the support and the faithfulness you guys give to listening to our episodes. And stay tuned for the next episode.